But yeah, if no one else has any questions about anything we went over, I'm going to move on to our little main subject of the day. Kind of a bottom to top mixing tutorial. Hopefully this will help quite a lot of people. Mixing some cocktails, exactly. Brain picking time, exactly. So, like I said, this is going to be a 0 to 100 kind of video. So we're going to be going in on the assumption that you know nothing about mixing. And we're going to build our way up to you mixing and mastering your whole track. We're going to be going through a lot of topics. I do not have a schedule for this. I should have written up a little lesson plan, but we're going to keep going, and then I'll probably, in the future, do another one of these where I go more kind of structured in how I do this. Probably when I start to figure out how to turn this into a YouTube video. So, what is mixing? I remember someone asked that. Shannon, I think you asked that. Like, what is mixing? Like, what does it mean to mix my song? To put it simply, mixing is making sure that all of the sounds inside of your project work cohesively together to create a combined sonic output, or they mix together to have the final output of a song. Mixing is making all of these parts work together. Make them all feel like one cohesive unit, one giant machine that works together. And there are a lot of considerations that go into this. There's a lot of effects that we use to mix our sounds together. But essentially, it's all coming down to volume. It all comes down to how loud things are in relationship to each other across their entire frequency spectrum, from the start of their or from the point where they start sounding to the point where they end their sound, and where they are placed in the left and right stereo image. Mixing is after the mix down. No. Mixing is the mix down. The mix down is mixing. There's a lot of schools of thought on mixing, which I'll go into in a little bit, but kind of just break it down. Like, everything that we do when we are mixing a song is an attempt to control the frequencies in terms of both their overall frequency, like the actual pitch that they are at, as well as their volume. And by controlling all of these parameters, and by all I just mean frequency and volume, we are going to get all of the sounds to work together. There are a few schools of thought about how you should approach your mixdown, both in terms of when you should do it and what you should be doing while you mix. One of the most common methods for mixing is what I call the many hats technique. And it's not, I didn't come up with that term. Other people have used that before me, so don't attribute that to me, please. But the many hats mixing style is more of a broader production mindset. This is much more commonly found in kind of self-made musicians, people who do all their own mixing and mastering and production, stuff like that. And they look at the production process as a lot of different hats that they wear. Like, the first hat that I would wear is my songwriter's hat, where I'm generating the song structure, I'm coming up with chords and melodies and lyrics. I'm trying to figure out kind of the emotional flow of the song. I'm trying to decide like what I'm going for, what mood I am trying to achieve, how I want my audience to feel, stuff like that. It's all kind of very conceptual. Then I would have my composer and my arranger or my orchestrator hats on, where I would be taking all of these notes that I've come up with, and I would put them in a sequence that works nicely together, that changes over time, and that changes to different instruments to create a full sonic palette. I would also go into a sound designer's hat around that time, where I would be creating the sounds and I would be layering the sounds. I also consider that orchestration in a way. I treat these all as separate tasks. And if you notice, none of this has talked about mixing, because the mixing hat goes on afterwards, where once I'm done with my project, I would go in and I would save a mixing session of that project, and then I would treat that as my moment to mix the sounds together. And then finally, I would put on my mastering hat, where I would try and get the song to sound loud and commercially viable. Another philosophy, kind of the opposite philosophy to this, would be to do it all at once, kind of mix as you go, produce as you go, treat everything as like one massive process of writing the song. This can work, but it can also be very overwhelming. The other way of doing things can be easier to comprehend, but can also take longer. So it's a matter of time versus mental energy, if that makes sense. And that second philosophy would be where, as you add in sounds, you do your mix down. You get things blending right together. You start to pan them. You start to EQ them. You start to adjust the volumes. You start to add effects like reverb and delay to create space, which is in fact an aspect of mixing. We'll get into that later, but reverbs and delays and all that stuff, that is also mixing. It can be sound design, but this is where the kind of the one hat kind of mindset comes in, where you're just the person who makes the music, because a lot of times sound design and mixing kind of go hand in hand, and sometimes you need to mix your track to compose, to arrange, to orchestrate, etc., etc. So I tend to do a little bit of both. I generally work on my mix as I'm writing the process, or as I'm writing the track. And then I will often go back and do a separate mixing session and compare the two mix downs to see which one I like more, because they'll often have very different sonic results. And when you go in to your mix, there's a couple of considerations you should make. Is there a specific procedure for mixing? Not really, Shannon, and this kind of what I'm about to go into. Because there's a lot of schools of thought about when you should do things, how you should do things, what frequencies you should focus on, stuff like that. There's a lot of mixing literature out there, things like the Mixing Engineer's Handbook, which I have, which I've skimmed through. It's pretty decent, but I haven't done enough of a deep dive to say whether or not I think it's good. Yeah, like there's a lot of philosophies as far as like keeping instruments as MIDI versus bouncing stuff to audio, using your ears versus using metering tools, when you should EQ, when you should compress, etc., etc. However, the one piece of information I've heard about this that I have found the most valuable is something that I was told by one of my audio engineering professors while I was at school. Maybe it was my mixing professor. I don't quite remember. I want to say it was either my mixing professor or my audio engineering, my audio recording professor. Because I had a couple of classes on these subjects, though my focus was on music theory. I'm going to say it was my mixing professor, but just in case it might have also been this other guy, they were talking about how there was a guest lecture, not at my school, but at another school they taught at, where like the mixing engineer for like the Beatles or for like AC/DC or for like Metallica, some major band came in to give a guest lecture on how to mix to a bunch of engineering students. And they were asking stuff like, so on Stairway to Heaven, how did you decide to compress the guitars? How did you decide to get the tone for your drum set? What type of reverb did you use? Or why did you use this reverb instead of that reverb? All these different questions. Thanks, Savage Patch Kid. And the engineers that came in answered pretty much the same way to every question. I listened to the sound to figure out what it needed, and then I did that. And for me, that's kind of the fundamental core of everything that I do when I'm mixing. It's a very reactive process where I listen to the sound and I ask myself the question, what does this need? And I can break that down into a couple of smaller questions that are a bit easier to understand if you're feeling like that's a difficult thing to grasp. Because sometimes you don't know what it needs. You don't know if it needs something. You just kind of know this sounds good or this sounds bad. So you can get a little bit more methodical. So the first question I would ask whenever I'm listening to a sound to mix it is, what does this sound have that I do not want? What can I remove from this sound to make it sound better? The next question I would ask is, what can I add to this sound to make it sound better? And then finally, what can I change about this sound to make it sound better? This can involve processing the sound. This can involve EQing the sound. This can involve layering the sound with other sounds. And this can involve things as simple as, adjusting volume and panning position. These are all ways to add, remove, or change the sound that we're hearing. So when I go into my mixdown, I have a little bit of a sequence that I have personally found the most comfortable, but it's not something I think everyone necessarily needs to do. But I have my reasons as to why I think it is beneficial. Before I kind of go into that, I want to discuss a few important kind of terms and ideas that come into mixing. The first idea, and one of the most important ideas, is this idea of headroom. Now, I've talked about this before on stream more than once, and I have a little kind of demonstration I can show with my webcam, which I think is really helpful. But let's just go real quick and let's just do this, where we're going to mute the output. I'm going to do it with a utility plugin. We're going to mute the output of our master. I'm going to set this to go in so that now my audio is going out of here. You can see that this volume meter shows a couple of pieces of information. You can see we have a green bar that extends up from the very bottom. I'll pull this all the way up, actually, just to make this visible. Surprised this isn't doing this. I guess this shows the afterwards. Yeah. Okay. So maybe if we do it like this. Yeah. Nope. Can't show it. Okay. So we're just going to show it on this one fader. Sorry. So, excuse me. You can see we have two green bars here, one on the left and one on the right. We have numbers that go down from kind of below 60, kind of climbing up, and lower numbers to 0, and then climbing back up to 6. You can see we have 6 on here twice. These numbers are negative. This right here is negative 60 decibels. This is 0 decibels, and this is positive 6 decibels. 0 is kind of our ceiling point, and I'll explain why in a little bit. You can see that we have kind of 3 separate kind of sections to this green line that is kind of moving up and down based on my voice. You have, first, this thing right here at the top, which is kind of like a solid line, or 2 solid lines right next to each other. Then you have this this darker gray line, and then this lighter gray line. This refers to 3 different aspects of volume over time. The solid lines are the peak volume at whatever moment we're at. So that's the moment it hits in. If I go t, that line is going to jump up to wherever the top volume is, and then it's going to stay there just to show me where we're peaking at. This is the peak volume. The gray is the peak current volume, whereas the solid lines are the peak maximum volume. You could look at the green line, or the dark green line, as wherever my volume currently is, and the solid green lines as, or the dark green bars as where my volume is currently peaking out at, and the green dashes as where my volume is peaking, what the maximum volume that I've hit is. The lighter green line is actually the average of the volume that it's heard over the time that the volume is coming in. Notice how it kind of slowly moves down. But it moves down slower than actually the peak volume. They come to kind of meet their own kind of unity level down there. And this shows kind of 2 different levels of volume. This is the maximum amount of volume, or the maximum amount of loudness of the sound. And this is going to be the average loudness over time. And these 2 numbers are actually going to be a big point in how we mix our songs, because we want to try and get these distances somewhat close together without having too close of a relationship. Because the distance between our average volume and our peak volume represents our dynamics. How volume changes over time. If something has no dynamics, it just stays at one volume, and we actually lose impact. We actually lose power, because it can get exhausting to have something stay at full volume for a long amount of time. So we want to keep some bit of a division between wherever our peak is hitting and where our maximum peaks are, and where our average volume is. We look at this in terms of a figure called RMS, or root mean square, where we take the square root of our mean over a period of time, and then we square that, or something like that. I'm not too familiar with the specifics, but if you're not a math person, don't worry about it. Just look at it as in the temporary loudest point and the average loudest point for the sound. And you can also see that there's actually 2 bars here. I mentioned that before. And every time this goes red, it's because we are hitting something called clipping. We are going over digital 0, which before I said that we had 0 and then we went over. We call this digital 0 because of the nature of something I'm going to talk about in a second called bit depth. But the reason why we have 2 lines here is because we technically have 2 independent channels here. What I'm doing is I'm actually recording a monophonic signal, but as I turn this left and right, you can actually start to see, well, maybe you can't because of how this is working, but if I get like input for 1 and 2, you can actually see that this signal is really only coming into one channel. The right channel has no information at all. So you could actually look at a stereo audio track as two separate audio tracks that are working together to create one complete whole. And that will have a very different response once you start looking at how you would mix these sounds. How these things would be placed. So, what is bit depth? What is 0? Why do we have negative numbers, and why do we work within negative numbers? And why is it that we can go above 0, but every time I have a signal that goes above 0, we actually get louder, or we actually get this red signal. I can push this up and maybe make this nice and loud. Nope, maybe not. You can kind of see it here on this. This fader is going into the red here, and sometimes, like on this fader right here, you can see it flashing red as I get really close to my microphone and kind of get loud. How's it going, Owsley? What's going on? So, bit depth refers to all of these different steps. Like if I expand this, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to hide the browser. I'm going to be hiding the overview. Cool. So if we look at this volume fader right here, Ableton gang, yeah. You can see that we can actually resize this. We can start from this smallest point where we have 60, 48, 36, 24, 12, and 0. We extend it a little bit more. We start adding in 24 and 18. Extend it more. We start adding in even more gradients. We get 54 in here, and we get 6 above. We get even more. We can go up to this full range. In essence, what I'm doing is I'm changing how many steps we have between silence, this level below negative 60, and the maximum volume, the loudest volume we have, which we relate at 0 decibels. The reason why we go from negative infinity to 0 is because we measure decibels as a relative amount of loudness. We have other forms of decibel measurement that are more rigid. We have this thing called dB/SPL, or sound pressure levels. And that goes from 0 decibels SPL, which is silence, all the way up to like 200, 300 decibels SPL, which is like standing underneath a jet plane as it takes off. That will make you deaf immediately. Yes, this is just changing the view, but what I'm doing is I'm illustrating the concept of bit depth. So as we lower the bit depth, we have less intervals of volume between our maximum loudness and silence. We used to have bit depths like 8-bit, 12-bit, and 16-bit. 16-bit audio might sound familiar to you. You might also see 24-bit audio. If I go Command-Shift-R, let me actually turn, Keycaster back on, so y'all can see what I'm doing. So what I did there is I pressed Command-Shift-R, or Command-Shift-R, to open up our export window. And you can see down here, we actually have options for bit depth. We have 16, 24, and 32. 16 and 24 are bit depths that have a ceiling on them. When you go over 0 bit depth, or 0 decibels, at a bit depth of 16 or 24 or lower, you actually lose all the information that goes over that point. It is lost. It is called digital clipping. And that's what we get when we do stuff like saturating, where you can kind of see, if I go here, I set this all off, and I set this to hard curve or digital clip. There we go, digital clip. You can see that this stuff, like once things go up, they just kind of get flattened off. Yes, that's not a problem with modern DAWs, and I'm about to get to that in just 1 second. So if I take a signal, I'm going to record myself speaking. Hello, This is me speaking into a microphone. So let's check what this sounds like. I'm going to switch to my headphones for the first time since we started the stream. Nope, we can't hear it because I have this muted. Hello. This is me speaking into a microphone. Now, as I start pushing this up, hello. This is me speaking into a microphone. I'm going to turn on soft clipping. I'm going to start pushing up the drive. Hello. This is me speaking into a microphone. Hello. This is me speaking into a microphone. Sounds pretty loud. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to pull this down a little bit and we're going to re-record straight from channel 3 and we're going to look at the difference between the waveforms. Hello. This is me speaking into a microphone. So already we have a very drastic difference. Yes, that's how memes were made. So let's look at this. You can kind of see that the waveform has this nice smooth kind of up and down. It doesn't peak. It doesn't get to maximum volume. But you can kind of see all of these different sounds have these nice curves to them. With all of these peaks right here in my voice from the waveform. Now let's zoom in and look at this one down here. Let's look at what happened. So look at the signal. This signal, like what we're doing is we're turning up the volume. This doesn't get distorted. So this just looks bigger. But notice how this one, which was for me louder. Hold on, let me close this and then close this. I need to remember how to close that. What is it? Okay. I think it's L. Yeah, it's Option Shift L. There we go. Cool. So, yes, it got cut. Thank you for kind of jumping ahead and while I was trying to figure this out. So you can see, as the signal gets loud and it pushes up past here, it gets flattened out. The information gets completely lost. It's like compressed. Yes, in a sense. It's kind of like compression. Notice how as this comes up, all these little ridges right here, yeah, it's clipped. Yeah, all of these little ridges are gone. You can see this bump right here, all of these ridges are lost. That's what happens when you send a file out that is clipping, that is going over digital 0. This is digital 0 right here, out and record it at 16 or 24 or lower bit depth. I want to say that was a Savage Patch Kid, right? Yeah. As Savage Patch Kid, there we go, mentioned, we actually no longer have to worry about that because we are in the wonderful world of 32-bit bit depth. It's also known as 32-bit floating point. The reason why it's called floating point is because the intervals of distance between silence and 0 are just like they are in 24-bit, where you have all these different intervals of distance, but whereas 24-bit and lower, at 0, everything above that is cut off. At 32-bit, we actually have almost 200 decibels of additional volume over, because what the computer does is it just adds on more and removes the ones at the top as we go back down. We just kind of keep growing up. Yeah, it's literally like hundreds of decibels. Yeah, it's literally like bit audio limit. Like I want to say like 32-bit goes. I want to say like like 32-bit goes like almost like there we go, 192 decibels over 0 or more. Like a lot of distance over 0. However, I should say your master, when it goes out to your audio interface, whether your audio interface is like a Focusrite Scarlett Solo or a Universal Audio Apollo Twin or a big expensive mixing rack kind of audio interface, or even just your computer's sound card. These are all 24-bit audio interfaces. They cannot output sound to your speakers that are at 32-bit floating point. All of the 32-bit stuff is internal. So once it goes out of here at 0, it is permanently clipped, unless you are exporting it as 32-bit. If you're exporting it at 24, it's going to be clipped. If you are listening to it through your speakers, it's going to be 24-bit. So you want to keep that in mind when you are dealing with your audio. You want to look at the differential of volume. Volume is king in mixing and in pretty much the whole audio realm. How much volume you have is a big factor there. So when I mix, I try to keep headroom, which, as I mentioned before, is a term that I've talked about a lot. In 24-bit audio, headroom, and pretty much in anything, headroom is the distance between your loudest sound and digital zero. So I'm going to come back and we're going to look at my webcam only for just a second. Boop. There we go. So headroom, the distance between the silence, the quietest point, the very bottom, and the point at which it gets clipped. Notice how the way I have this camera framed, I would even have this probably a little bit further over this way so that could be a bit more centered. Like that. There we go. So, maybe this way. Yeah, there we go. Much better. So, I like to use my webcam as a good illustration of what headroom means, because I literally have a head. I have this thing right here. And this distance right here, this is my headroom. This is literally the room that my head has between where it is audible or where it is present and where it gets cut off, where the information is lost. Anything that goes over the headroom is gone. The tops of my fingers are no longer present in the recording that I'm doing, in the broadcast. It's no longer there. So, as I pull things up, I start to occupy space, and eventually things are going to start to get up here, and I want to make sure that I have a good amount of distance between where my head is and the top of the camera, my headroom. And your mix is very much like this. As you start adding in sound, you're going to be pulling up the volume that you have, getting closer and closer to digital zero, reducing your headroom. So I like to mix in a way that maximizes my headroom while still allowing for a reasonable distance. You can notice it's not like my camera is down here. Like, this is headroom too. This is a lot of headroom. But look at all this space that I don't need. Look at all this stuff. It feels awkward, doesn't it? It feels like I'm like super tiny. It feels like I'm very weak, like I'm very small, almost like I'm a child when I'm down here. So I like to have headroom that gives me just enough space so that I can kind of like adjust myself and move around and gesticulate and do all these things. But I still have a little bit of space that I can, if I need to, move up and add a little bit of positioning there. Let's see. When you know that much things about music theory, isn't it harder to make happy accidents while producing? No. Well, yes, but no. Like, I have found generally that the more information I learn, the more likely I am to make a happy accident, because I'm actually mixing up two different ideas. Whether it comes to sound design, whether it comes to music theory, whether it comes to mixing, I think that knowing what possibilities there are gives you a lot of options that can lead to further happy accidents. because you'll start to create more connections. So no, I don't think that it is harder. I think it's approached differently. And instead of making happy accidents, I can be more planned, and then my happy accidents can actually go into territory that people who don't know music theory might just wander into and that I already know. Like someone who doesn't know a lot about music theory might stumble across this when they're just playing notes. They didn't mean to hit that, but they know that they have to do that. They know they have to have that note right there, but instead they accidentally hit that note. And it feels very cool, so that might be a happy accident for them. For me, I already know how to use that, but maybe I'm like, well, I want to go and I would do something in Phrygian. Accidentally played a minor Phrygian chord. I played a minor 1, minor flat 2, minor 1, minor flat 2. That feels very interesting. That was an accident. Maybe I'll have an accident where I'm trying to voice a very thick, luscious chord, and then I go and voice it in a way that I wasn't expecting, and I find a sonority that I really like. So it's a different concept. And what Shannon said, to kind of bring us back to the mixing topic, is it's like a water bottle. You can always take water out of the water bottle to get down to a point where it's empty, get down to silence. But there comes a point where if you put too much water into your cup, into your bottle, it'll start to overflow out. And anything that is overflowing is lost. So you got to be careful with that. So that's my little video explanation on what headroom is, and why I mix with headroom. So going into the actual practical process, what are loofs? All right, so let's take a brief moment to talk about loofs, and then we'll go into the practical process. This would actually be a bit more of a subject for mastering, Shannon, but real quick, loofs stands for loudness units full scale, right here. And you can see these are different LUFS volumes. You can see you have stream 19 and stream 18. You have minus 14 loofs for streaming. So loofs is an attempt to create a consistent, universal form of volume. So before, I talked about how we have peak volume and RMS. These are both relative volumes based on whatever your output is on your speakers. LUFS is consistent everywhere, consistent across a bunch of different platforms. 14 LUFS, minus 14 loofs, is minus 14 loofs everywhere, no matter what speaker you're going out of. That's the same volume, assuming they're putting out the same decibel level. Like if I have my my speakers putting out volume at whatever is 50% for them, if I put 5 different songs through those speakers that are all at minus 14 loofs, they should all sound at the exact same loudness. So I would do a little bit of Googling on loudness units full scale, or loofs, and this will help quite a bit. This is generally a big thing for mastering. Exactly, Shannon. Exactly, and that's a good point, Lil Saf. Different music outlets have different loofs requirements, and you can look those up. Streaming platform loofs. You can kind of find different LUFS metering accounts, like Apple Music is minus 16, Spotify and Tidal are minus 14, YouTube is minus 13. We'll get into this more with mastering, and I don't want to go too deep on mastering today because I want to focus on the mixdown. But the important thing to notice here is if you make your track louder than these LUFS volumes, they'll just get pulled down to that volume, so your track will actually sound quieter than someone else's track. This is why if you go to Spotify and you listen to a lot of dubstep, there's going to be songs that all of a sudden sound really, really quiet. Like Mr. Bill mixes and masters to about -14 loofs in general. So I would say that the songs on this album right here, on Apophenia, are going to sound louder than most of the songs put out by Must Die. Even though if you played them in a club, Must Die's music would be way louder. Way louder. But you can always turn a song up. It's much harder to turn a song down. So maybe it's worth it to look at mastering at least to like -14. I generally shoot for about -10 or -12. I don't mind if my songs get turned down a little bit. But if I'm explicitly trying to plan for a streaming service, I'll shoot for -14. But anyways, on to the practical side of mixing. So I'm going to assume we all have a song that we're all working for. I'm going to close this for a second. And I'm just going to fill this session with a bunch of audio tracks. Just a whole bunch of audio tracks. Close these all down a little bit. There we go. Close this down. Perfect. Maybe open these all up a little bit more and make this a little bit less. So what we can see here is a lot of different mixers. Let me even make this a bit wider. There we go. So we can start to see these volume numbers. If you notice, all of my volume faders are set to a certain volume. They are normally set to start here at 0, which is what most mixers are set at. I have actually set my new default audio tracks to start at -infinity decibels volume. This goes back to what I'm talking about with headroom. This maximizes my headroom. If you have all of your songs going in, or all of your sounds going in at 0 decibels, and you're trying to mix, you're going to be pulling stuff down, you're going to be pulling this down, you're going to be pulling this down, you're pulling this back up, you're going to be moving up and down, and you are fighting with your headroom. You're fighting with this distance right above your head. Let me just double check, make sure. Okay, we're good. You can mix like that, but I feel like that can often be a bit difficult because you're struggling with your limit. Why not gain stage? Well, this is gain staging. This is gain staging. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit, actually, but I consider this a form of gain staging. So instead of doing that, I like to start everything at silence and then move it up, because then I get a more accurate representation of my headroom. What Saf is talking about is this idea of gain staging, which really, for me, gain staging comes before the mix. I actually consider gain staging to just be proper production technique. And what that means is, like, if I have a clap, let's find a clap. Yeah, so there's a clap. If I set this to 0 decibels and I look at that, you can see that that sound hits at 0 decibels. Let's pull it down a little bit so it's not hitting at 0. So now we can see it's hitting at just over -8 decibels. I'm going to go in and I'm going to add in a saturator to that track, which is just going to be distortion. I'm going to set this all to default. You can see already, just from putting this on, the signal has jumped up by about 4 decibels. -8, -3. So almost 5 decibels, I'd say. That can actually bias our perception of how this sounds, because the human ear is really fucking stupid. And I mean really fucking stupid. For some reason, the human ear believes that if something is louder, it sounds better. Part of the reason why is because when a sound is louder, we can hear more details in it. There are more high frequencies in the sound, and it can create a sensation of power relative to what we had before. So this is another reason why I like to have things at silence and then pull them up, because I'm not getting confused by things being loud and me pulling them down. Because when you have something loud and you pull it quieter, it might sound weaker. So what we would need to do is we'd actually have to adjust, we'd have to gain stage so that the volume going into this plugin and the volume going out of this plugin are the same. So I'm going to set this down 4 decibels. It looks like we still have about a decibel, so I'm going to do minus 4.8 decibels. So we're at minus 7, minus 7.9, minus 7.9. A 0.01 decibel difference, that's so minuscule, it doesn't really matter. So now we can actually compare what this sounds like with the distortion versus without it. Now, it might be hard to tell, it might be very faint, but I hear that this actually sounds darker. This sounds less bright. We're losing high frequencies. So I actually don't like that. I think that sounds worse. So we would actually turn this off and would remove this. Whereas, if we didn't gain stage it, it sounds quote unquote better, doesn't it? We hear more of those high frequencies, but once we set this back to a proper volume, we notice that it's actually a little bit darker, a little bit more muffled, a little bit less high frequency. So this is the importance of gain staging. Let's try a different type of gain thing. Let's use overdrive to accentuate those high frequencies. So we can see, again, we're increasing the volume by about 1.5 decibels. So I'm going to use a utility plugin to set it down minus 1.5 decibels, and now I'm going to group these so I can turn them on and off at the same time. So let's see. So we're still about 0.3 off, so I'm going to do a minus 1.8. So with this one, I actually like this quite a bit because this brings up a lot of that high frequency. Feels a bit snappier. So this is why gain staging can be helpful, because now we can tell the difference between that on and off without being biased by the perception of the sound. And I will say, this also applies to other effects. Now, I generally save equalizing till very late in the process. I generally am not equalizing right away. Do I ever produce on stream? I want to right now, Nizoni. It's a bit difficult, yeah, because my computer has been having trouble managing both streaming and working on projects with a lot of plugins. but I do want to start streaming. I'm going to be spending the next couple of months to start building a streaming PC. So hopefully before the end of the year, I will start introducing production streams again. But for now, it's going to be pretty much all educational stuff, which I guess is kind of good for y'all because that means y'all are going to learn. But let's look at something interesting. I just have put an EQ on this channel. I'm going to pull this up a little bit. So we have the signal off. We have the signal on. Do you notice something interesting here? Let's scooch these in real quick. I'm going to actually delete these because we can go into this more later. Because this is more important right now. So we are cutting frequencies. We are removing frequencies from this sound. Almost inaudibly, but I'm actually going to turn this off because this is getting annoying. I would just want to have this sound. Notice this is at minus 5.8. This is minus 7.9. Equalizers can add volume. You notice this actually added 2 decibels just from cutting frequencies. So we could actually pull this down 2 decibels. And that's another reason why you'd want to make sure you're gain staging properly. Yes, be very, very careful. Be very, very careful when you're equalizing, when you're compressing, when you're doing any sort of processing. You want to make sure that you are properly gain staging. So gain staging applies to your mixing, but I would say this is just a general part of your process, is making sure that anything you add or do to a sound is not influencing the overall volume perception. So that being said, I generally don't EQ until very late in the process. I if Q2 has it. Potentially. There is input and output gain controls on Pro Q2, so I'm sure it does. But when mixing, yeah, isn't it good to just adjust volume within the synth? Yes, absolutely. But sometimes you're doing stuff outside of the synth. Like, do you only adjust the volume within the synth, even if you're doing other processing? Like, so what Savage Patch Kid is saying is, like, if I have this synth right here. Oops, let me turn this up. And I start adding stuff to it, like I start filtering it. You can see this is at, oops, turn this off. Minus 10, turning on a filter. Minus 13, so we'd want to turn this up 3 dB. But what I'm talking about, Savage Patch Kid, is going past that. Like, what happens when I EQ this? So it looks like this is not causing any gain control difference, so we don't have to worry about it. But if I start to add, like, distortion, you see this is at minus 5, turning on the saturator. Minus 3. What you're saying is we should take this from minus 6 to minus 8. That could work, Savage Patch Kid. You could do that. but we do have a gain control on here, so why would we change it here if we can change it on the actual effect or using a gain control plugin? I like to use gain control left to right. I'll use this within to try and get my sound to a certain volume level, but I generally don't adjust this once I've started adding post-processing. Before going to mastering, do you also do a gain staging for the whole mix from mastering, or it depends? I would say it depends, Shannon. It generally depends on where my track is peaking. If my track is peaking just under or at or over 0 dB, I may use like a gain control on my master to pull it down a couple dBs to get under 0 and then do my mastering. But sometimes I'm totally fine and I don't. It really depends on the sound. So now that we hopefully understand why gain staging is important, let's talk briefly about the difference between volume and loudness. Because everything up until this point has just been talking about volume. And we know that when you turn up the volume, something sounds louder. But it's not as clear-cut as that. Either one, Savage Patch Kid, both are fine. Even mixing down at 0 is totally fine because you're working in 32-bit. But once you go above 0, that's when things start to get rough. No worries, Damphir. You should watch the VOD. We're at 2 hours, 46 minutes. I would just watch back on the VOD later. Take care, Damphir. So, as I just said, we know there's a relationship between volume and loudness, but not all volume is considered equal. I'm going to go over here to phase plant, and I'm going to put in some white noise. I'm going to make sure that this is outputting at 0 dB. This is going to go down. I'm going to play this note. This is at -4, so I'm going to turn this up 4 dB. So this signal is hitting at just about 0 decibels. We are just about there. We're even going over a little bit. So I'm going to back it down a little bit. A little bit, like there. There we go. Still going over a little bit. Pull it back down a little bit more. There we go. So now we're sitting just under 0 dB. I'm actually going to turn this down after this, just so that we can work on this. What we have is we have noise. Whoops. Turn this down a little bit. Like I said. So now this is white noise. Sounds like white noise, doesn't it? What happens when we look at it through a spectral analyzer? I'm going to remove this so we can just see the final volume. You can see that generally, all of these frequencies are hitting at about the same volume. I'd say the sub bass is just under -36, and the highest frequencies are just over -36. They're all around -36 decibels. We could even flatten this out a little bit, go a little bit under white noise. I would say at about this point, everything is hitting at about the same volume. But mostly all I hear is shh. I just hear this bright, hissy top end. I don't really hear any of this stuff right down here. This stuff, I don't even know if I hear it. Maybe I do, but I know for sure I don't hear any of this stuff. So what happens when we turn this slope down to this middle point where we get what's called pink noise? Let's hone in on there. Close enough. There we go. Perfect. Oh. Interesting. I can start to hear this low end now. But to my ears, this low end sounds about as loud as the high end. So see, clearly as we go up in frequency, we need less volume to sound as loud as lower frequencies. Higher frequency, less energy for the same perceived loudness. We could even go further, go all the way down to brown noise. This is starting to sound very muffled, but that low end sounds very powerful. How's it going, Congo Hund? What's going on? So this brown noise is an even more biased slope, where the low end is louder than the high frequencies, but the high frequencies aren't lost. White noise is equal volume across all frequencies. It's every single frequency at equal volume. Pink noise is every single frequency at equal loudness. This is why you might hear people talking about, a pink noise mix. I generally try to kind of look at mix downs, like if we put this spectrum not on the individual track, but on the master fader and looked at what came out, I would want things to have a bit of a pink noise slope, where the low end is clearly higher in volume than the high end, and it gently slopes down. Everything is about as loud as each other. This is another reason to pay close attention to your headroom and your gain staging, because you don't want your high frequency sounds to overwhelm or overpower your low frequency sounds. Because as you can tell when we go back to white noise, we can't really hear that low end at all. It's lost because of that high end. So when working on your tracks, I find it to be very helpful to think about, is my track white noise or is my track pink noise? This doesn't mean you have to use white noise or pink noise in your projects, or you can't use white noise in your projects. What it means is you want to have a balance across all your frequencies in terms of loudness. You want to have your low frequencies higher in volume than your high frequencies. If you're having trouble with this, one thing you can do is get a sample of pink noise. I'm just going to record this really quickly and just get this out here. And then let's flatten that. So now we have a sample of pink noise. Do you mix with pink noise post or pre-processing? I would do this. I would do this post-processing. And what Savage Patch Kid is talking about is what I'm doing here, where I'm gonna just gonna duplicate this throughout our whole project. We're just gonna have a whole bunch of stuff taking up the whole length of our song. I'm gonna turn this all the way down, and then I'm gonna set this up to what would be our reference mix volume level. And I would also have all my other sounds down to silence, down all the way down to negative infinity. I generally like to mix to about -6 peak, -12 RMS. I like to stay around this range because I find that gives me just a visual indicator and a mental kind of safety point, because we start at 0 here at the top, and then we gonna go down 1 divot, 2 divots. 2 divots down gives us -12. So if my stuff is generally in this range, I can both trust my ears and my eyes. You don't need to do this. I'm going to stress this again. You do not need to mix to the volume I'm mixing at. I personally like this based on how I set my volume on my speakers, how I master, and how I think about my mixing. You can go all the way up to 0. You can do -12. You can do -24. They all work, but I like mixing to about -12 or -6. So I'm going to set this to just under -6. Now, what I would do is I would go and take every single sound in my project. I would even move this a little bit lower. I'd say maybe like -10, because I would have it just below where I want my mixing reference to be. And then I would mix everything so that all of my elements are just slightly louder than this pink noise. So I can just barely hear them over the pink noise. Then when I'm done, I turn it off and I listen to how the mix sounds. Now my mix will be more biased in a even, equal loudness curve. That being said, I don't do this when I mix. I do not mix with pink noise. I do not like the way that my mix downs sound, because generally my mix downs start to feel flat in the higher frequencies, because you typically want a little bit more of an even slope as you get up. You kind of want it to kind of come down, and then even out. At least in my experience, that is what I've noticed. So if you're having a lot of trouble, if you're really, really struggling, this can get you to a good volume balanced mix. However, I would consider this a crutch, not a tool. This is not something you should use forever. This is a crutch, not a tool. It's something to kind of give you support, not help you develop. So instead what I do is I just think about my mix in terms of a general structure. I'm going to close this one down again. And I look at my track in terms of this, where we have a bunch of different frequency ranges. First, we'd have our sub-bass frequencies. Then we'd have our bass frequencies. Then we'd have our lower mids. Then we'd have our mid frequencies. Then we'd have our upper mids. Then we'd have our high frequencies. And then we would go to noise. Remove that. Opposed to starting with everything down. Yes. You can do faders down mixing. That's what I call it, where I have this, where each of these tracks is set to negative infinity volume. All the faders are down before I begin mixing. But you can also do this with the pink noise mixing. And this is how I would arrange my mixer inserts. I would have my lowest frequencies at the far left of my mixer, and then my highest frequency sounds on the far right. I'm going to actually get rid of frequencies here, and it's not noise. It's not noise, it's noise. So what I would do is when I begin my mix down, this is going to get into the practical advice. I would sort my project based on low to high, and then I would start by pulling up my lowest frequency sound to wherever that mixing reference volume was for my pink noise. Maybe a little bit louder. So I would generally set like my sub bass or my kick to be around here, be around like -6, -10, -12, maybe a little bit higher. And then I would start going up in frequency from low to high, pulling my faders up from silence, using my ears to try and make it sound as loud as whatever frequency is below it. And so this would come up like so, and then this would come up, and then this would come up, and then as I went up in frequency on my mixer inserts, I would end up going down in my overall volume. Clearly, the individual faders might not be exactly like this, especially when you have a much larger project. This is a very reductive way of looking at it. But it would kind of generally slope down like this, where this is at -5, -7, -8, -9, -12, -13, -17, which is kind of slowly slope down and probably even start to even off as you go up. And this is before we do EQing. This is before we do compression. This is before we do any other mixing processing. I consider mixing processing to be the sounds that, as I said at the beginning, or the process that I said at the beginning, combine all of the sounds together, mix them together to work as one final whole. If you are doing something just to make a sound cool, that's when I would focus more on just gain staging and not on mixing. And then I would do this when it comes to the mix, when it comes to making things fit together. You're going to have to spend a lot of time, in my opinion, doing this, because I feel like the volume faders are the majority of your mix down. I would say the vast majority of your mix down is going to come down to how you adjust these volume faders in relationship to each other. Yes, before EQ, what if you want to remove unload? Well, why are you doing that before fixing the volume? That's my question, Kangahund. Like, because I legitimately think that the gain stage is the most important part. Like, I would say that EQing adjusts volume. EQing is just volume faders across your frequencies. Like, if I have an equalizer, well, don't forget. Well, I'll get to that in a second, Kangahund. But this is why I do not do this. If I do this, well, all I'm doing is I am removing volume from this area. So this is volume control. This is just volume control in a specific frequency. That's really all this is. So the majority of my focus is going to be based on this. It's going to be based on making sure things are sounding good here. This is a more important measure of volume control. And if I start EQing things and then adjusting the volume, that might change. No, I get it. I get it, Savage Patch Kid. I know what he's talking about. I understand. I promise you I know. But thank you. I'm pretty sure I got this. I've been doing this for 6 years now. I like to think I know at least a little bit of how I do these things. I mean, you can totally do this, and this gets into different mixing philosophies. When do you do things and why? I'm showing you my mixing philosophy. This is the way that I approach my mix down. I want to get these balanced right because honestly, I don't want to EQ if I do not have to. If I do not have to EQ something, I don't want to do it. This goes back to what I said before when I was talking about the mixing engineers for like fucking the Beatles or Bob Saget or Bob Dylan or whoever, where we said, I listened to the sound, I figured out what it needed, and I did that. If a sound does not need EQ, it's much more important that I adjust the volume faders, because the volume faders are going to be more important in terms of what it needs. If it doesn't need EQ and I just start EQing it, I've potentially ruined the sound. So I would rather start with what I know it needs. I know every sound is going to need a volume fader mix because we got to balance the levels. We got to make sure things are level matched. We got to make sure that things are volume balanced correctly. That's much more important. That's much more essential to a mix down than it is to do a whole bunch of EQing. And also, sometimes you don't want to remove the frequencies on the sound specifically, Kangahund. So that changes where we're going to do stuff. So, like, I'm going to take a brief break and talk about EQ, but I don't want to go too deep. If I am just cutting frequencies from sounds on that sound, this can, as you saw before, change the volume of the sound. We saw this before, Kangahund, where we had a sound, I applied an EQ, all I did was I cut frequencies and we actually gained 2 to 3 decibels of volume. So this is where the volume control matters, because once we gain stage, then we're going to have to go through and do that volume adjustment anyways. So why not do the volume adjustment first and then EQ and gain stage and see if we need to adjust it again? I'd much rather do that. I'd much rather do that. But let's continue moving on with just kind of like the way that I approach my mix downs. So once I've gotten the volume faders set up, I will actually go in and turn off my mono plugin. Generally, when I work, especially when I mix into a mono plugin. I want the sound coming out of my speakers, coming out of my headphones, to be monophonic while I'm working on most of my mix down. So, and most of my mix down is volume faders. So once I get this, I'm gonna make sure that everything sounds good just based on a mono mix. So when it gets printed to go out to a club, there's not going to be any mono compatibility issues. I know it's going to work because I've already mixed it to sound good in mono. Once I'm done with that, I will actually turn off the mono plugin, and then I'll focus in on my pan pots. So if I turn this off of stereo pan mode on all of these, whoops, not that, this, you can see that what we have is we have a knob that goes left and right. And if I find, let's see if I can find something that has a knob. Yes. Give me 1 second. You know what? No, I know what I have. Hold on. Oh boy. Okay, so we have this big thing here, which is my DJ mixer. You can see these big fucking knobs. See these big fucking knobs right here? These big pink knobs? On this really fucking dusty mixer. I have not used this in a while. I hope to set it up, but you can see that these knobs, they have a white line on them that they can change to move direction. I have this one, and this looks kind of like this right here. If you see, there's a middle position. It can go left and right. So I could look at this as essentially a pan pot. You can imagine this as a little dial. Pot is short in this context. It does not refer to my packs. Like this has pot in it, but when I talk about a pan pot, what I'm talking about is a potentiometer, which is a form of variable impedance control, a form of controlling electrical flow. So as I turn this to the left or to the right, or inverted for y'all, to the left and then to the right, I'm changing the position. And you could look at this as in center, all the way to the left, all the way to the right. This is how we're adjusting the placement between the left and the right speakers. I'm gonna put this down now, because this is heavy. So, how's it going, Raid? What's going on? So, pan pots. Now that we know what they are, why would we use them? They allow us to place a sound not just all the way in the left channel, all the way in the right channel, but anywhere in between. And you're overheated, well, you should drink some water and like lay down and turn on your fan. Be careful, friend. But believe it or not, this is essentially just this. As you turn a pan pot, you are increasing volume to one speaker and decreasing volume to another speaker. When we hear sounds in a stereo audio track, we actually hear two discrete channels. This goes back to what I was saying before, where we have like this thing, or you can kind of see these two independent bars, and you kind of see as I pan this left and right, you can kind of see that the left channel is gone. As I slowly turn this to the left, we start bringing back the left channel, and then there we go to the middle, and then all the way to the left. But notice that when we're at the middle here, I'm going to step back a little bit. When we're at the middle here, I'm peaking right at about 0. When I turn this all the way to the left, notice how I go up to 2 decibels over 0, because I have now turned up this channel while turning down the other. Pan control is the same as volume control for specific channels. And it's going to sound really weird if you do not pay attention to what's going on. So, this is why I like to mix into mono, because this is going to bias volume. And I want to make sure I have my volume set so that as I start to increase panning, I can also keep an eye on my volume change and adjust accordingly. And I want to try and use my pan pots not even as a placement tool, but more as a mixing tool, because as we just saw, we can get channel-specific volume. We can lower and raise volume in different channels. So if I have something panned to the left and something else panned to the right, and they both share frequencies, since now they're now biased towards one channel, they're not actually going to be masking each other. They're not going to be taking over the frequencies that the other sound has, and they're not going to get lost. That's what masking is. When you have 2 sounds that have similar frequency ranges, one of the sounds is going to start to cover up the sounds or the frequencies from that other sound. Panning can help dissolve this. What else? When you are panning things, you also want to keep an eye on the balance, as I kind of mentioned there. Like, as you pan things to the left, you should probably also be panning things to the right, not just because you can separate their frequencies, but because you can get a bias. Like it sounds kind of weird when you hear my voice and then you also hear it kind of panned to the left. It feels like you're kind of tilting your head in a direction. And same when you do it in the other direction. Just kind of tilt your head. So you want to be very careful with that. And as you pan things, you want to try and, again, balance the volume, and you want to try and make sure that there isn't an emphasis in frequencies in any one channel. So once you're done with your volume faders, you're going to go focus in on your pan pots, because this might, again, make it so you don't even need to EQ things, because maybe you'll just need to move things around. And even a change of like a couple of degrees, like 5 or 6 degrees to the left or 5 or 6 degrees to the right, that'll actually do quite a heavy impact to the direction of the sound. I would even go further and put everything on a discrete control between the left and the right channels, because then you could start to hone in on specific ranges. And yes, my beard is coming back. It'll probably be back by the beginning of July. I can have stuff that's just right here, stuff that's all the way over here, but not over here at all, stuff that's in this range, but not on the extremes, in the center to a little bit to the left and the right, but not far left, not far right. Have stuff over here in the left. You can start to create even more space and make sure that nothing is interfering. I would suggest that as you're panning sounds, don't have any 2 sounds that are exactly in the same position. You can have maybe like your ultra low end, like your mono sounds, like your sub bass and your kick drum. Those can be centered. But if you can have like one element that is at 15 left, and another element that is at 16 left or 18 left or 12 left, that will actually be enough of a division to create a sense of independent space and to make sure that there aren't a loss of frequencies. So, like, I would say most of my time spent mixing is just adjusting these volume faders and pan pots. Like, a large portion of my mix down over the past, 6 months has focused more and more in on this. Do you adjust the volume as more instruments come into the mix and some go out? Absolutely. And this gets to, again, kind of what I was talking about with EQing Kongahund, is this is all a consistent process of kind of going back. Like, I'm going to go in, adjust the volume faders, then I'm going to go turn off mono and start panning stuff. Once I'm done panning stuff, I'm going to go back and tweak the volume faders because things might start to pop out, things might start to fall away, and I want to make sure that those things are presented. As I EQ things, then I'm going to start adjusting volumes because maybe things will no longer be masking even when they are in different panning positions. So it's kind of like a back and forth. I treat the volume fader as like the in-between step for every process. I start with it, do the next step, go back to it. Do the next step, go back to it. Do the next step, go back to it. Because I'm always refining, I'm always tweaking. And I feel like that leads to a much better mix down than just kind of like starting with one thing and then kind of leaving the volume mix for the very end. And it leads to less changes as I go. Let's see. Also in terms of automation, yeah, as you say that, I'm going to start to move on to the next step, which once you have your volume faders and pan pots, I personally prefer to EQ before compression. And again, I don't necessarily EQ every sound. I only EQ a sound if I think it needs to be EQ'd. If I listen to it and I hear sounds mixing. When wide mixes, is that more desirable and sound better? It can. It can. I feel like a wide mix sounds more full and a mono mix sounds more narrow. But you got to be careful with wide and pushed out too far. Because a lot of times people look at wide and look at it in terms of like mono versus stereo. So they make their track super stereo. And I don't think that's as desirable or better. I think focusing in on pan pots and then going in and doing stereo widening afterwards, I think that helps a lot. But I do think that wide mixes sound in general better. But I will say that this is very much a generalized thing, and I want you to go back to what I said at the very beginning of what does it sound like it needs? And generally, if it sounds good, it is good. Thank you, Goku Ball, for that follow. Thank you so much. Let's see. Also in terms of automation, yeah, I would say volume automation is a big part of it. But I generally do volume automation at the very end because compression is volume automation. But before we get into compression, I like to work on EQing. If you are not sure how to EQ your tracks, if you don't know what you're doing, if you're starting from zero and you're really struggling, here's a couple of things that I think can help. The first step would be to actually go against what I just said. I do not personally EQ every sound, but when you're just starting, you can. Throw an EQ on every single sound in your project. And then you're just going to do a simple starting point process. First, you're just going to do 2 filters. You're going to have a high pass filter and a low pass filter. You're going to set the high pass filter all the way down, the low pass filter all the way up. You're going to start with your lowest frequency element, and this is including your sub bass and your kick, by the way. And I'm being serious about that. I want you, when you're first starting out, to EQ every sound, including your kick, including your sub bass. You're going to solo your kick, solo your sub bass, and then you're going to pull up on your high pass filter until the sound starts to sound thin, until it starts to sound weak, until it starts to sound like it doesn't have a body to it, like it sounds like it's missing its low end. You might find that you'll get to pull it up a lot farther than you were expecting based on what you see, because this is using your ears. This is trusting your ears. Then you're going to pull it back down until it's just below where that point was. And then you're going to go bump it up a little bit. You're just going to give yourself a little bit of a bump right at that low end. Just a tiny, tiny bit of a bump. Then you're going to do the same thing to the top end. where you're pulling all the way down until it starts to sound muffled. Sounds like you're putting a blanket over the sound or like you're putting it underwater. Then you're going to pull it back up. This, you can choose whether or not you want to bump. This is going to be the first time which I give you a moment of choice. If you feel like a little bump adds energy and power, keep it. Otherwise, don't do it. Then you're going to go to the next sound. Do the same exact thing. Have high pass, low pass. And then you're going to pull that up, pull it down a little bit, bump it. Pull it down a little bit, pull it up, maybe bump it. And then you're going to do this for every single sound in your mix. I should have mentioned one thing I forgot to say is if you notice this is soloed, once you're done doing this, you should actually unsolo your sound. Before moving on to the next one, I'm really bad because I forgot to mention this. Before you move on to your second element and do this, you should actually unsolo your sound, listen to it in the context of the mix, and see if either you can pull down a little bit further, see if you can add in more stuff without it sounding worse, or see if you can actually take away more if there's frequencies that you do not need. And you might be able to make up for it. And then you go on to the next sound, solo it, adjust the filters, then unsolo it. See if you can either cut out more or add some back in. Move on and go up your mix down until every single sound is only cutting out the frequencies that it does not need. These are all unwanted frequencies. This doesn't even get into frequencies that are interfering with other sounds. This is just the frequencies that that sound itself doesn't need to fit into the mix down. Once you're done with that, you can go and you can start doing surgical mixing. You thought I was a mountain. No. My shirt is this, the moon and a big old pupper. Big old pupper. I love puppers. Anyways, once you've gotten this set up, what you can do is you can actually go look for problematic frequencies. No worries, Snobby, you'll get there. You should go watch my 0 to 100 on music. Go look through my VODs, Snobby, if you're feeling lost. Go down to here, click on videos, go down to view all broadcasts, scroll down here until you find one of these things that say Theory Thursday. There should be one here, this one right here. This is a 0 to 100 stream I did on making music. I talk about all the stuff I'm talking about here, but I talk about everything else, about picking your workstation, about analyzing songs, about learning how to use your DAW, about chords, about scales, about melodies, about bass lines, about stacking songs together, about automation, about mixing, about mastering, all of this stuff. So if you don't know what I'm doing, watch this video. It's 8.5 hours though, so it's a long one. But anyways, once you have the sound kind of set in like this, what you can do, and this I would not do soloed. I would go in with a narrow banded bell EQ, this thing right here, and I would start sweeping around the sound, and I would look for things that sound bad. Some sounds will sound bad around here because they sound kind of
money. It sounds kind of like blah blah blah.
Like let me show you kind of what I mean. So let's turn these off for a second. Let's go ahead and mute my mic in OBS. Hi friends, I'm back. So, you can see where my voice is. If I push up right here, then all of a sudden we get like this really weird, almost boxy tone. It just sounds kind of put through like a speaker. It just sounds kind of nasally. It sounds a little bit strange. This is generally not desirable. We want to be careful with that. You can also push up like this frequency. Sometimes you have unwanted bass. I find another place with a lot of common problem frequencies is right around here. So if I start saying words, you'll hear a little bit of a whine in certain things that I say because of this peak right here. Whoo, peak, peak. That's another one. E, ooh, ah. You can kind of hear this really annoying frequency right here, right around 3.5 kilohertz. That is a very problematic zone. Another one is going to be up here around 10K. You hear this? If I go tss, 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 that is where we hear a lot of hiss. So I would keep an eye around here above 10K, around here around 2.5, 3.5K, and around here around 200 to 300 hertz. So you're just going to go in and you're just going to just gently sweep until you find something that sounds kind of bad. And then you're going to pull it down. You're just going to try and get rid of that frequency. You're just going to try and surgically remove unwanted frequencies. And the reason why you would want to do this while listening to other sounds is because this will also prevent masking. Masking, as I said, was when you have two sounds with similar frequencies taking up the same space. If we look at where my voice is, you can kind of see that there's a big bump right around here, right around the 100 to 200 hertz. There's a big bump right around here, right around 2.5. Another big bump right here around 7. And then another big bump right around here at around, I'd say 11, 10K. So those are the important frequencies for my voice. Oh shit, Econ, hey, thank you for the follow and thank you for the 250 bits. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. How's it going, buddy? What's going on? So, if I was looking at other sounds, now that I know that my vocal wants to have this, wants to have this, and wants to have this up here, I can actually go in and cut that out of other sounds to make this more present. And then I can actually go in and turn down the volume of that sound because now it's no longer conflicting. What would you listen to? Just a background sound? No, I would listen to it in context of the mix. So like, for example, like if I'm EQing a vocal, I would look for frequencies that are in maybe like my synth leads, and then I would try to cut that from those, or maybe add that to my vocal. I would go to those synths and I would find what frequencies are in my vocal. And I would cut that. If I have like a synthesizer and a pad, like if I have like a melody synthesizer playing like some melody, and then I have a pad synthesizer and they're taking up the same frequencies, I would look at the frequencies that are in the melody and I would pull them out of the pad. And I would also sometimes, if a sound is feeling very particularly annoying, once I've done that, I would actually go in and finally solo individual sounds. And I would do, again, very surgical EQs, doing that same sort of sweeping and boosting thing to look for the bad frequencies. But now I'd be looking for ringing. I would be looking for ringing and whistling frequencies. So if I go here and I grab this famous chant, I'm sure we all know this sample. Even if you're not a musician, you've probably heard this sample before. It's a very classic hip-hop trap sample. Maybe you can hear it, but I hear a whistling tone. If I go in with an EQ, I'm going to use Pro Q3 here. Can you see it? this node right here. That's exactly the purpose of surgical EQing. I went in and I listened to the sound. I was like, oh, wait, there's an improper frequency. I went in and what I did here by holding my mouse here, it's just a faster way of doing this. Got your dogs, I bet. No problem, Econ. Thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate it. Hopefully I'll see you later. Pads are hard for me to EQ because they have frequencies in all range of the spectrum usually. Oh, totally. I get that, Savage Patch Kid. That's kind of why I'm talking about, like, first going in and got your dog. Sorry about that. Going in and looking for these frequencies that you can cut out that are whistly frequencies, pull them down, and also looking for masking frequencies. So, like, if I go in here, I'm going to turn this off, set this on so my voice is going in. And I'm going to go in here. I'm going to send this actually to this channel to the sideband of Pro Q3. So if I turn on this view that shows us the sidechain input, so if I can get this going, let me get it and turn this on. So let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay. So you can see here, this is my voice. This is literally my voice. You can actually see where the frequencies in my voice and this sound are interacting. You can kind of see a big spike right here where that frequency that I cut out was. And you can see another spike right around here. So if I had a vocal, I would potentially want to mix to cut out some of these frequencies up here and maybe some of these frequencies right here so that I could make sure that my voice is not lost with this sample. So that is an example of how you would cut out these frequencies. And again, going in and being very aggressive with your EQs can help a lot, Savage Patch Kid. Have you ever completed a song and had to go back and redo the frequency because it's annoying? Yes, all the time, Snobby Knobs. I have definitely had to do that more than once because a mix down, honestly, here's one of the most important things that I've found. A mix down is never completed. It is only surrendered. Because there's always stuff you can do, and you could tweak for hours. And at some point, it gets a bit subjective. So that's kind of the way that I would approach it. So with that, we've gotten kind of the three basic parts of frequency control and volume control out of the way. We have volume faders, we have pan pots, we have EQs, and then we have compressors. So why would we use a compressor? A compressor is a form of automatic volume control over time. My mic spikes at about 8K. Oh, for sure. Thank you for letting me know. Let's see if we can fix this in this. Let me go in and let me actually do this, because this is my EQ. Let me actually turn this off. I'm sure my stuff is EQ. I need to do some better EQing on this, obviously. But now my vocal is going to be much less compressed, much less controlled. I've turned off this equalizer and this compressor that I have on my vocal. So now I'm going to record a couple of lines where I'm going to talk in very different volumes. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. No, not a earache warning. No worries. What we're just looking at dynamics. This is kind of what I talk about when I talk about dynamics. You see how, let me close this. This is very loud and this is very quiet. The distance here is the distance in dynamics. This is very dynamic because it has a lot of change. We wouldn't necessarily want that. So what we can do is we can use a compressor to make sure that the distance between these loudest points and these quietest points are closer together. This is when I would EQ, when you had all these big jumps. Or excuse me, this is when I would compress. I actually very rarely compress my songs. I very rarely compress them outside of mastering and distortion and stuff like that. But like vocals, very gently compressed most times. So let's put on a compressor and let's see what happens when we start to play with these parameters. Let me turn off the sidechain. So let me turn this out. If I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes. You can even see these spikes in this visualizer right here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find wherever most of these peaks start at, where the highest peak or where the lowest peak, the big jumps, sits at. It looks like it's about this one right here. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. This one right here, volumes, right there. That's about where it would go. So I would want to set my threshold to be just underneath. If you don't have access to a visualizer like this, you might have something that looks a bit more like this. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. I'm looking at the dark gray bar. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some... So I'd say right about here. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So it's just underneath some of these quietest peaks. From there, I would start to adjust the other parameters. All of these parameters are going to be linked together. And the first thing that's going to happen is that the sound is going to get quieter. First, I'm going to adjust the attack, which is how quickly the volume attenuation, the volume decrease is going on. Because all this is doing, once I start activating this is turning down volume. It's almost as if I was going in and for every sound, automating a volume control to kind of like pull this down a little bit and then pull these down a little bit and then maybe have these stay back up at normal and having all this stuff. This takes a lot of fucking time. This is really fucking annoying. No one wants to do that. No one wants to do that. Sometimes I do that if I really have no other choice, but that's why we made compressors. So a compressor is the difference between the attack is the difference between having something snap down like this or having something slowly fade down like this. This is what the attack does. The release is the opposite direction. This right here is basically what a compressor is doing. And then you would have something at the end that pulls it all up. But we'll get to that in a second. So as I decrease the attack, this is going to snap in on the gain reduction a lot faster. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. This is me speaking at a bunch of... So what I'm looking for is I'm trying to find where it looks like it's coming down and following the contour of the voice without slamming down immediately and feeling like a square wave. I don't want that. So generally, I like my attack times to be somewhat short, unless I am trying to preserve a transient. But like anywhere like from like 0.05 milliseconds to 0.15, 0.25 milliseconds is pretty good. Use your ears as well as looking. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. Then we're going to set the release time, which is going to be how quickly it comes back up to normal volume. Because right now, this is just following each individual spike, and we don't necessarily want it to do that. We want it to be more natural. So I'm going to start increasing the release time. If you notice, I start with my threshold at 0, my ratio very low, my attack at maximum, and my release at minimum, so that it's barely affecting the sound. and then I slowly pull it up. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try, you see how most of these spikes are starting to go away? This is me speaking at
Looks
a
more
bunch
natural,
of different volumes.
more like a bunch of loops.
So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume. So now that I got that, I can start saying the ratio, which is how much it pulls the volume down. The threshold is the point at which it starts pulling down the volume. The attack and the release is how fast it attenuates and then returns to normal volume. And then the ratio is how much it actually turns it down. Generally, ratios over 3 to 1, or even ratios over 2.5 to 1, are pretty extreme. When you have a ratio of 1 to 1, what this means is for every decibel that you get in past the threshold, another decibel comes out. Totally, Melody, feedback is closed today. Please read the screen. If you look at the screen, you can see right here. Do you see this right here? You see this? I can't do it today. Feedback closes. It's open on Friday. It's open tomorrow. Well, I mean, I mention this like every single day, Kongahund. Like literally every single day I have to tell often the same people. Feedback is on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. Never changes. Never changes. Monday, Tuesday, Friday. Monday, Tuesday, Friday. I've said this multiple times. I have it on the screen when feedback is open. I have it very clearly labeled. I'm more than happy to listen to everyone's songs, but I'm expecting y'all. It's Friday here. All right, I'm done. Anyways, let's move on. I'm sorry, Melody. Tune in tomorrow. This is not what we're learning right now, but thank you. I appreciate your sass. I'm sure you're serious, but you're not helping anyone, but thank you. Anyways, at 1 to 1 ratio, when you get 1 decibel in past the threshold, you get the same amount out. At 2 to 1 ratio, for every 2 decibels past the threshold, you get 1 decibel out. So 2 decibels past, you get 1 out. 4 decibels past, you get 2 out. So it cuts it in half. At 3, it's for 3 decibels, you get 1. At 6, you get 2, etc., etc. And so it goes up. So clearly, the higher the ratio, the more aggressive the compression. Let's start with just a 2 to 1 ratio. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. This is me speaking. Notice how it's much more consistent. It's quieter than this. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, specifically around balance, listen to how balance goes over. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume. So now we've actually compressed the dynamic range. We've adjusted the total volume so that the highest peaks are now brought down. So now they're all at about the same level. What we'd want to do is, again, gain stage. So we actually have a proper balance of frequencies over time. So now I can look at this. This is me speaking. I can see the gain reduction. I can see the input volume. This is me speaking at a bunch of different... And the output volume is quite lower. So I'm going to pull this up. Oh, shit. Hey, Jared with the 3-person raid. What's going on, buddy? How you doing? This is actually good for you because we're talking about mixing. I would definitely recommend watching this VOD, Jared, because we're going in on mixing today. Doing a big 0 to 100 on mixing. And now we're just talking about compressors at the moment. So... I'm going to slowly increase this output volume so that the threshold input volume and the final output volume are at the same level. So I'm turning out the final output. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume I kind of actually want to increase the ratio a little bit. I'm going to do 3.5 to 1. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So, if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume. All right, so that sounds about right. So let's record this output. Oh, no worries, Jared. Take care. Have a great day. See you later, buddy. And let's look at the final result. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So, if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. Would you do that for a drum loop? I would potentially. The question is, do I want there to be big spikes and then quieter sounds? Or do I want there to be more consistent volume? Because as you can see, if we look in on this, this spike right here is gone. This spike right here is essentially gone. All of these big spikes in volume have been evened out. You see? So it sounds more consistent. And this will tie back to EQ, to volume, etc., etc. So like certain drum loops would want this, certain other loops would not. I listen to the sound and listen to what it needs. If it feels like it is jumping too much, like it's kind of loud and quiet, loud again, quiet again, and it just keeps jumping back and forth or something like that, then I probably would want to compress it. And I would also say that in general, instead of necessarily doing a 3 to 1, I would probably do like a 2 to 1 here, and then I would actually do a second compressor to kind of bring the overall volume together. So this is just catching the peaks. I'm setting this to RMS, which as I said before is root mean squared, which is more gentle of a compression, more based on the average time, like this solid line rather than this darker line. So I'm going to do the same thing, but now it's just going to be to try and bring everything up. Sure, I can do that. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So, if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So, if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So now, instead of having one working working super hard, I have two working in a much gentler capacity to just kind of massage the sound up. And I feel like this feels a lot nicer. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So let's look at what that waveform looks like. This is me speaking at a bunch of different volumes. So, if I try and balance this, there might be some weird spikes in volume over time. So see how these are much closer together? This is all much closer together. Now, Savage Patch Kid asked about glue compressing. And glue compressing is generally the same sort of thing. You can see this has all the same parameters. You have an attack, you have a release, you have a ratio, you have a threshold, and you have makeup gain. But you also have a couple of other parameters. You have this soft clip thing, you have this range thing. These are just special things, but in essence, this is the same exact control. The main difference between a glue compressor and a normal compressor is that a glue compressor, or at least Ableton's glue compressor, or Cytomic's The Glue, which is a similar thing, basically the same exact plugin, but as a third-party VST, you will find that it is what I call more musical, The way that it's designed is supposed to try and control the peaks of multiple sounds at once. It's trying to basically smush sounds together using compression. So it adjusts over all of the frequency bands a little bit differently than a normal compressor. And these settings are a bit more rigidly defined. You can see you can't set exact time controls. You have 0.01 milliseconds, zero point 0.1 milliseconds, 0.3, 1 millisecond, 3 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, and 30 milliseconds, as well as 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, 1.2 milliseconds for release and automatic release, which is also available on the main compressor. So this is going to give you a slightly more consistent result for every single sound going into it, rather than for one individual sound or for a group of sounds. Threshold works the same, ratio works the same, makeup gain works the same. The thing I like about the Ableton Glue compressor is that it has this soft clipping mode, that anything that goes over the clipping point is going to start to get rounded off, kind of like a distortion unit. The time constants aren't strictly milliseconds because the ratio affects the speed of the gain reduction. Yeah, that is a good point, because you can see here in the bottom left, ratio sets the ratio between input and output level. The knee becomes sharper at higher ratios. So at 2, you have a gentler knee, which we didn't talk about before. I'm going to go back to the main compressor and talk about this. But as you adjust the ratio, you adjust the attack and release time somewhat. So like I said, it's more musical. A knee, we can see this here, is going to be this. Do you see how on this visualizer you have this coming down? The yellow circle represents our threshold point, and then those 3 vertical lines that are moving back and forth represent the knee. As I increase the knee, it gets wider. As I decrease the knee, it gets shorter. And what this is doing is this is determining how the curve of the compressor's attack and release responds. It kind of adjusts the attack and release times to be more smooth or more sharp. And in the glue compressor, as you increase the ratio, you are decreasing the knee. So it creates a bit smoother or a bit sharper of a compression curve. And these times aren't exact because of that. So it kind of tweaks these ratios in a way. This range knob will actually determine where the distortion or where the saturation comes in, where the soft clipping comes in. So this can be another useful tool to kind of, like, if you are pushing stuff up and you're feeling like it's not getting loud enough, you can actually turn on soft clipping and turn down this range. It gives it a little bit of beef. So that's kind of the difference between these two compressors. I would say this one right here is more mathematically accurate, more quote-unquote perfect. This is more musical. This is more responsive to other sounds. So that's generally where I would use glue compression over individual compressors. So I'm trying to think what else we would talk about. I talked about compressors, talked about EQs, talked about volume faders, talked about pan pots, talked about masking, talked about bit depth, talked about headroom. Reverb and delay. So we all know what reverb and delay are, I hope. If you don't, I can show you real quick, because I think there are still some people here who are not from the music community. So, reverb is this. Reverb is the reflection of sound returning to your ears, or at least in this case, returning to the microphone. If I look over this way and talk at my wall, y'all are not hearing my voice directly. What you're hearing, let me actually turn this up. what you're hearing is the reflection of my voice, which is why as I turn further and further away from the sound, I get a little bit more metallic in how my voice sounds. Because you're not hearing the direct voice, or you're not hearing the direct signal, you're hearing the reverberation. You're hearing the sound bounce off the wall and then return to the microphone. Why does it look like you're at a pro at talking to your wall? Because I spend 6 hours a day talking to a camera. So, when we think about reverb, think about it in terms of two types of sounds. You have direct sound and reflected sound. So, the direct sound is just the sound waves coming from the emanation of the sound source, in this case, my voice, going directly into your ears as represented by this microphone. Beyond that, there is reflected sound, sounds that go past your ears, hit other surfaces, and start to come back to your ears as represented by this microphone. First, you're going to have what are called early reflections. That's going to be the stuff that just comes back so fast, it's almost as if it's part of the sound. I'm going to turn this off because it's kind of distracting me. We'll go back into that in a second. Some more taps on the mic, yes. So the early reflections are just like, they're the tiniest bits of the sound that just kind of blend with it and create our immediate perception of the space of the sound. The later and later reflections are what we actually think of as reverb. That's why when I clap my hands, you can kind of hear a little bit of a shh in the background. If I go back to this, and I start turning up this reverb, you can actually hear this stuff in the background that is generally just my voice, just kind of combined together with another copy of my voice. And later in time, we can start to adjust parameters on this reverb, such as pre-delay. So you can affect stuff like the diffuse sound versus the early reflections. See, this, what we're hearing right now. Hold on, here we go. So, this is what you hear as early reflections. As I turn my voice up, you can start to hear the difference between my main voice and the early reflections. This is the actual reverb. You can hear that there's actually a strange disconnect. It feels very weird, doesn't it? When I have just the diffuse, just the reverb signal, and I don't have the reflected signal. Notice the difference. This actually sounds pretty natural. It sounds kind of like I'm in a very tight room, a very small room, because there's not a lot of space for diffuse signals to bounce around a lot. But without that, it actually sounds like there's a separation between my voice and the reverb signal. There's a big difference there between these two things. Now, in addition to reverb, we also have delays. And as I kind of mentioned, reverb is the sound hitting a surface and bouncing back to us. And as I turned up this pre-delay, the further we got to like a certain point, it started sounding like an echo. A delay or an echo is just a reflection of your voice coming back so late it's no longer considered part of the original sound. And we can replicate that just by copying the sound. Like this. So, let's look at this delay. You can hear it's just repeating my voice. I can actually set it to no longer be synced to the beat, but be based on time-based parameters. So I could set it like this, or I could set it much closer, like this. Hello. And now it actually kind of starts to sound like I'm in a room. I could get tighter, and now it really starts to sound like I'm in a room, doesn't it? Here, you can kind of hear how it now starts to sound like my voice is changing pitch. So, at a certain point, delayed signals are really just indistinguishable from reverb. Doesn't it sound kind of like a really old reverb? It's kind of neat, don't you think? It sounds like, doesn't this sound kind of like a reverb? If I turn the feedback down a little bit, there we go. So, literally, when you are using reverb, you are using a bunch of tiny delays. Now, when you are using reverb or delay, you can use them as as sound design tools, as creative tools, as arranging tools, but they can also be used as mixing tools. Because when you add reverb to a sound, it actually starts to push it further away and makes it sound farther in the distance. So, you can combine reverb and delay to create very interesting spaces. And the more you put something into reverb and delay, the further it will feel pushed back into the mix. Especially if you do that stuff directly onto the sound. You can push it back and make it feel really close, make it feel really far away. You can make it feel jumpy. And have fun. So, I would generally do my reverb and my delay closer towards like the sound design process, the the arranging process. But I will consider, like, if I have a sound that feels too present, it feels too close up in my face, I will actually add reverb to it to push it further back, to make it feel more muffled. And there's actually some stuff with EQ you can do to make stuff feel more muffled. If I start increasing low end and I start decreasing high end, it kind of makes me sound like I'm in another room, doesn't it? Doesn't this kind of sound like I'm talking to you from the other room? If I have this down, hey, can you turn off your music? Hey, I can hear it through the wall. And in the same way, if you start to increase the high frequency, it actually makes things sound closer to you. So, playing with high frequency is actually a really good way to control space, just like with reverb and delay. I'm trying to think. So we got reverb, we got delay, we got EQ. Let's see. When using multiple reverbs in a song, do they need to have settings that imply they're in a similar space? It depends. It depends on what you're going for. I'm going to turn this off for a second. So, when we're looking at using more than one reverb in a song, there's two philosophies for this. One would be if you are trying to, if you are trying to make something sound real versus if you're trying to make something sound alien, make something sound inhuman, make something sound foreign. Thank you so much for that follow, official had matter. So if I was going to use multiple reverbs, the first time I would have the first thing I would do is I would look at it in terms of long reverb versus short reverb. Things that have a very slow, short decay time versus things that have a long decay time. Things that have short reverb are going to be much closer to me. Things that have long reverb are going to be further away. They don't need to have the same exact settings. They don't need to follow a lot of the same stuff. They could be very different. It just creates a sense of space. If I'm trying to do something that sounds like it's a real band or a real orchestra in a real place, I would actually have multiple reverbs that I would change the pre-delay time. I would change the decay. I would probably have the same decay time. Most of these parameters would be the same. I would change the pre-delay. And I would then use one more reverb that is designed to combine all of those reverb signals together and create a cohesive space for them. So, it mostly depends on the style of song you're writing, what you're trying to go for, if you want things to feel more realistic or less realistic. And, when in doubt, just have fun, experiment. That's a big part of all of this, is experimentation. Like, if you don't know what something would do to a sound, then you would end up just lost if you didn't mess with stuff, you didn't experiment, if you didn't just test sounds. Differences between Valhalla Room, Vintage Burbank, etc. Those are going to be different colors of reverb. That's going to depend on how they bias certain frequency responses. So the difference between let's say Valhalla Room, which has a lot of parameters and you can mess with and create really cool sounds and change all this stuff. And this controls the algorithm for how it changes, adds, or moves different signals. So you can do a lot of stuff to change the sound, change the frequency response. You can see very slow reverb attack, lush random modulation, a dark tone. Doesn't have a lot of high frequencies, whereas this has a lot of high frequencies. This does, and this has a lot of build-up right at the beginning. And we could compare that with something like a little plate, which is a plate reverb, which has a specific sound. Where is it? Here we go. And it sounds nice. This is what a plate reverb sounds like. So it's just the algorithm. It's just the process by which the delays change in frequency and time. So that's the difference between those. Actually, I just thought of something else. Since we're talking about delays, and because reverbs are just delays, let's look at other effects that you can use for sound design and mixing that are also just delays. This is a delay. You can actually see here, a chorus has two delays. You have one delay that you can adjust the time of, and then another delay that you can adjust the time of. And then, if we do this 100%, you can see that I can actually mess with both of these independently and create a very interesting space between these two sounds and maybe link them, unlink them, and that creates a bit of warmth and movement. That's especially when I have this mod on, because what this is doing is this is shifting the time ever so slightly, as well as the phase of the signals as compared with the dry signal. That's what this modulation is for. This is changing the phase of the delayed signals. So a chorus can also push stuff back like a delay can and add stereo width, because the phase cancellation shifts how things are moving in the left and right channels. You also have a flanger, which is a form of a delay. because you can see here delay time down here. Feedback as I pull this down, we just get slight delays. As we pull this up, we get more of a delay on this flange signal. And then feedback is what creates this hissing noise that's very iconic for flanging. And if you think about it, a flanger kind of sounds like someone dragging a guitar pick up the string of a guitar. You ever heard that blip, 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 blip kind of thing? That's what a flanger is doing. That similar sort of effect. It's almost like you're running a pick up and down the voice or the sound. A phaser is the same exact thing, only instead of being controllable in terms of the delay time, you're controlling the frequency offset of the delayed signal. Because that frequency offset is what creates this kind of rushing sound that just creates this kind of movement, and at very high feedback amounts, it kind of sounds like a whistling tone, kind of like that, and you can hear it kind of whistling up and down. For me, a phaser kind of sounds like on a sound. That's what is happening when you're delaying a signal. So like if I record my voice going like, "Hi, my name is Josh." So now we have this signal. I'm going to duplicate this down here. "Hi, my name is Josh." Now I'm going to shift this just a little bit. "Hi, my name is Josh." You hear that? That is phasing as these signals change ever so slightly. We'll even shift it just a little bit. "My name is Josh." You hear that? "My name is Josh. My name is Josh." That's what a phaser is. And if you can adjust these... "My name is Josh." While it's playing, "My name is Josh." You can start to create very interesting textures. What else is a delay? Clearly, grain delays are delays. They can create really cool sounds, especially if you start messing with times. You know, you can just play with stuff, and it just creates this wonderful wash. You hear that? It's nice. What else? I'm trying to think if there's any other... I'm sure there are other effects. Just keep an eye out. Delays are everywhere, and by changing the nature of the delays, you can change the nature of your sound. So this is why I'm saying these are both sound design tools and mixing tools. You can use them to either bring sounds forwards into the mix or push them back into the mix. FabFilter Pro R is definitely a great reverb. I use Pro R quite a bit. I like Pro R. I like that you have kind of this decay rate modulation, so you can kind of exponentially kind of control the decay rate as well as the actual decay time. So you can kind of play with this and have a lot of fun with that. You have control over the distance and the character. You can make it darker, brighter. You can actually EQ both the reverb signal or the output signal. It's really cool. I dig Pro R, but you know, reverbs are reverbs, or reverbs are reverbs. What else? Thank you, Nintendo fan, for that follow, by the way. I appreciate it. I guess we can go back a little bit to talk about compressors, because I remember Silo was talking about sidechain compressors. And if you look at my compressor, the first time I add it, it actually has this little yellow arrow turned on, because I have this external sidechain input turned on. Sidechaining is not just making things duck against your kick. A lot of things can sidechain. Let's see, we can sidechain a compressor. We can sidechain a corpus. We can sidechain a gate. See here, sidechain input. You can sidechain, what else? A lot of things, generally. Anything that is kind of controlled by another signal can be sidechaining, because that's all sidechaining is. It's the same thing as if I go in and, like, let's say this is my sound, and then this is other sound, and I want something on here to be affected by here. I could go send this to sound and then affect it that way. But a faster way is just use sidechain inputs, where, like, I have a compressor here, and I'm going to set the sidechain input to this other sound. Maybe this other sound is a kick drum, and maybe this sound is a vocal. So let's get a kick drum. There's our, whoop, not there, there. Oop, let's turn all this off. And now we have a kick drum. Set this on quarter notes real quick. Loop this. Then we have our kick drum. Now I'm going to add in this vocal loop. And now, just like I did when I was compressing a sound, I'm going to use this sidechain compressor, or this compressor on sidechain mode, to do the same sort of things. Only, as you can see, this is not the information on this track. This is the information on this track. You can see the waveform here. And the sidechain, set it to the other sound, it's following the kick drum. So this compressor is responding to the input of another signal, but it's still going to do that volume control thing that we saw before. So I pull this down, set the parameters as I normally do. You can kind of hear. I'm going to exaggerate it for effect. Turn off the kick's volume. You hear that? Pumping. That's the sidechain compressor pulling down every time the kick comes in. This leaves space. This can be a creative tool. This can work not just on your kick. You could potentially sidechain your whole song to your vocals. You don't even need to use a compressor. Like, let's do the same thing but with a gate. Notice how every time the kick comes in, it goes above. Let's flip it. This is functioning in much the same way as the gate. And with this flip on, only when the kick cuts in does the signal come in. So you could use that for a creative effect. So, you know, you can have some cool effects done. And a lot of things will actually accept sidechain input. Like, we saw Pro Q3 accept sidechain input. So, like, we'll turn this, set this to 4 sound, directly into there, turn this on now. And then, hopefully, is it not going in? Oh, there we go. Now we can see my voice showing up as a sidechain input here. So I could go in, I could actually start to adjust this stuff. I could actually make this respond to the sidechain input, I believe. I'm trying to figure out how. I want to say you can. Maybe not. Maybe you can't. In certain things you can. I know you can in things like Pro MB. I wonder if you can sidechain to multiband dynamics. You can. You can also sidechain to multiband dynamics, which will allow you to do this based on specific frequencies. And like if I have Pro L2, which is a similar effect, or Pro MB, excuse me, I'm going to set this to 4, set to here. So now you can see this. So now I can set this to compress based on Where is it? The external input. So now I can actually just compress these specific frequency ranges when this cuts in, just like that. So every time the vocal cuts in, this cuts out a little bit of this signal, just a tiny bit. And I think that that's a really cool effect. Being able to do this is actually really, really strong. So I really like using this for side chaining. You can also kind of simulate sidechain inputs by using plugins like Volume Shaper and whatnot, an LFO tool. So see which plugins you have that have external sidechain inputs and see if you can send stuff into them and see what happens. As you saw, it's not just for sound design, but also for mixing. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to talk about. Let's take a step back and go back to what I was talking about with EQing a while back. Because if you remember, I talked about EQing every single sound, and that's a good way to start. But as someone asked me, I don't actually EQ every single sound. I tend not to EQ sounds if I can help it. Part of why is you can mess with the phase of a sound. And if I have a signal and I combine it with itself, you'll notice that EQing can also change the phase. So like let's get a vocal sample. Hello, I like potatoes. So let's take this signal, let's duplicate it, and let's apply an equalizer to it. Let's see what happens. So we have this signal. Hello, I like potatoes. So without the EQ, hello, I like potatoes. Hello, I like potatoes. Just sounds louder, right? Let's just do a gentle EQ. Hello, I like potatoes. Hello, I like potatoes. We're just cutting out unwanted frequencies. Hello, I like potatoes. That's strange. Hello, hello, hello. Notice how all of a sudden my voice got kind of, hello, nasally? Hello, I like potatoes. You hear that? That's really strange, isn't it? Let's open up, let's see what I can do to show this. Let's open up Pro Q3. Hello, I like potatoes. Hello, I like potatoes. Hello, I like potatoes. Hello. Look for strange Hello. Bumps. I like potatoes. Hello, I like potatoes. We have that shape. Now let's look at the shape. Hello, I like potatoes. Hello. Notice how there's a big buildup right over here. Because what's happening is we're shifting the phase of this signal, and combining that phase shifted signal against itself creates phase cancellation, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So I wouldn't necessarily want to EQ this. If I had like two microphones recording like drum hits, and I had like microphone bleed, I wish I had a recording of like a drum kit here. Because if you have like multi-microphone setups, like let's say I have three, actually hold on, let me do something like this. I'm going to use this thing right here. This is a little Tascam recorder. And I'm going to record myself twice, once on here and once on my DAW. I'm going to see what happens. Hello, I like potatoes. All right, so I got this signal. I'm going to go grab this, import this into my DAW, and we'll see what happens. Hold on. So I'm going to plug this in. And let's see what this signal does. Because now we'll technically have 3 recordings of the same microphone. Or of the same thing. Let me go here. You open this up. Let's line this all up. That's strange. So let's do this. You can see there's slight differences in time here. So I'm just kind of adjusting this to get it in. I'm surprised it actually has such big of a difference here. Do you see that? That's really strange. But it kind of adds to what I'm talking about, how there's going to be problems in the recording. So let's see what this sounds like. We're going to set these both to the same volume, just about -14. You sure you didn't stretch it? Maybe, I hope not. Oh, maybe you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it just time stretched. Yeah. That's strange. I didn't even realize it was doing that. Good eye, good catching. I was like, wait, how? I didn't think I had it time stretched. Okay, so we have hello. I like and this up to 0. Hello. I like potatoes. Now we're going to slowly introduce this one. Hello. I like potatoes. Hello. I like potatoes. You hear that weird phasing? Hello. I like potatoes. That's a big problem. If we EQ it, it's going to get exaggerated. Hello. I like potatoes. Hello. I like potatoes. So you got to be very careful with that. Yeah. I'm surprised that it did that. But yeah, like let's say I have a drum set and I have like 3 microphones. I have a microphone on the kick drum, I have a microphone on the snare drum, and I have a microphone on top for the overheads. There's clearly going to be some bleed there, right? Where like some hits from my snare are going to get caught in the microphone for the kick drum. Some hits from my kick drum are going to get caught in the microphone for my snare. And those both are going to get picked up by my overheads. If I start EQing these sounds and cutting out problematic frequencies, but they're still locked in with the other sounds, those cross signals are going to start to phase with each other, and then that'll sound really bad. So what I tend to do is not EQ every sound. I might do a little bit of EQ. I might do, instead of a cut like this, I might use a shelving EQ and pull down on those frequencies on the sound, not get rid of them altogether. And then I'll use a bus, either a group like this in Ableton or a mixing bus where I have like a bunch of different stuff, call this submix, and then send all these channels to the submix bus. So now this is going to be kind of like a group for all of these sounds. And on that one, that's when I would go in and actually EQ and cut out the unwanted signals. Because that way, all of these phases are combining together before being cut off. And I think that sounds much nicer in the long run. I think that's about it. I can go into mastering if people want, but I actually kind of want to save mastering for another day because that's a whole other topic. Ooh, actually, hold on. There's one last thing I want to say. Really essential. If you feel stuck on any of these processes, and even if you don't, there is one thing that will guarantee your songs sound good, and that's referencing. That's listening to your song and directly comparing it to other songs. One way you could do that would be to take your song, export a bounce of it, put it in a playlist, and then listen to it next to other songs and compare back and forth. That's not as optimal, but it's good. What I like to do is I like to have a track in my project that goes past my master. You see this is set to external out. This could send it to master. This is bypassing my master, going straight to my speakers. And then I can just mute this and put the song directly in my project. and solo it back and forth to hear what my song sounds like in comparison with their song. I can check my mix down. I can check my songwriting. I can check my mastering. I can check my song structure. I can compare whether my volume EQ is correct, whether my delay EQ is correct, whether my song is too overcompressed or undercompressed. And I can just trust that if my song sounds as good as their songs, then my song is going to sound good. So I strongly recommend you do something like this. If you have a plugin like Magic AB, which allows you to check on stuff past your master, that's even better. But this works. I don't know how to do this in every DAW. I still have no idea how to do this exact process in FL Studio. So if anyone knows how to do this in FL Studio, please type it in the chat, because I'm just at a loss. I don't know how to do external output direct monitoring for tracks. But yeah, I would keep an eye on that. When you're mixing, if you're doing a volume mix pre-master, I would actually turn this down to whatever your reference volume is at. I usually set it's like -10 or so, and then I solo that, and then when it comes to mastering, I'll pull this up. But if anyone doesn't have specific questions about mastering, I think I'm going to skip that, and maybe next week I'll go in depth on mastering, because I feel like mastering is its own subject. And I'd actually like to do a little bit of research on mastering before I go into that. But if anyone doesn't have any questions about that, I also to open to any other questions. Music theory, sound design, mixing, arranging, orchestrating, anything like that. This is now the time for questions. It looks like we got through the 0 to 100 a little bit faster than I was expecting. I don't know if I missed anything. I think I got everything. I think that's a good starting point. It's a good way to go when kind of covering all the issues, kind of what you might need to worry about. But if no one has any questions, I might just call the stream. Thank you for that follow, Octorob. Because as I said at the start of the stream, and as you can see right here, I gotta turn the stream off in 2 hours. So turning it off early is not a problem for me right now, just because I have to move into a new apartment, and I'm going to go visit the apartment in 2 hours. Well, technically 2.5 hours, but I will be moving at the end of this month, so there might be a bit of a hiccup around like the 28th and to the 1st. I'll keep an eye out on that. I'll try and make sure that there is as minimal a break as possible in the stream. This was helpful for me. Helped me kind of understand a lot of stuff that I had trouble putting into words, so this was helpful. I liked the beginning of the stream. That was really fun. But yeah, I don't think there's any more things. We have officially hit 1,000 followers, even though 900 of those followers are bots. How do you feel about mixing, mastering headphones? Sure, this is a great thing to end on. I personally prefer to mix with speakers. However, mixing with speakers is dangerous because you need to have a treated room for it to properly mix or to properly sound like you want it to sound. Like my room right here is not treated. You can see the walls are, I'll even go over here to show you. Like the walls are all completely barren. You can see there's like a big steel pole over here. I have a window right here that is completely unblocked. I have no sound isolation at all. So mixing on that is really biased. Certain frequencies are going to get emphasized, certain frequencies are going to get lost. So mixing with headphones is much better in that situation. However, when you're mixing with headphones, you actually get a distorted perception of your stereo image. Because when I'm listening on speakers, on these things right here, right past where you can see them on the camera, the sound is moving through the air and into my ears, and I hear everything in the space. So I can hear things where they're supposed to be left and right, and kind of my mix is kind of like to my left, to my right, and in front of me. As well, reverb is not going to be over exaggerated. On headphones, reverb is going to be exaggerated because it's not dispersing into the air. We get it kind of cut off like this. It's very isolated in our headphones. And also, our stereo image is going to be isolated by each ear. Like, our ears are really good at kind of combining left and right channels to create stereo. But when you just have things going directly into your ears, left and right, the sounds kind of feel like they're kind of centered in the middle of your head and then kind of spreading out from there. Whereas on computer or on speakers, on monitors, it's more in front of you. The sound kind of feels like it's over here rather than kind of here. So that'll change your perception of sounds. Because one is propagating sound waves through air, the other is propagating sound waves directly into your fucking ear holes. I would also say there's a difference between closed ear and open ear. So, this right here. If I can get it. These are my Audio-Technica ATH M50Xs. These are actually surprisingly good headphones for the cost. I'd say these are great entry-level headphones. I still mix on these. I use these a lot. And I mostly use them to DJ. Because they're closed ear. You see how this is a solid back? This is what you're probably used to seeing on headphones. On the inside, solid. I put these on. Sounds outside of this area are now slightly cut off. It isolates the information into my head alone. This can even more distort these perceptions of reverb, of stereo, etc., etc. So that can be an issue. But if you have a lot of external noise in your area, this is helpful. I prefer open ear headphones. You can see this one. There's actually these meshes on the sides of the headphones, where on this one, it was solid. You can even see the drivers on the headphones. And on the inside, same sort of thing as on the inside of those. But these are much more open. Why would someone use open back? Well, the reason why I use open back is because the sound actually propagates out into the environment. So I get a more natural perception of reverb and stereo image. This also tends to have a little bit of a flatter EQ response, at least in my experience. So open ears are much better, especially if you need to listen in your environment as well. Open ears are beneficial, but I just like them because they don't kind of distort my perception of certain elements of the mix as much as closed ears would. So that's my reason for using open back. And I think other people would agree. But I think that's about it. I mean, yeah, I would say as long as you're referencing, it doesn't really matter. Like, if you can compare your track to 10 other tracks and they all sound as good on your headphones as your track sounds on your headphones, your track's good. That's all there is. Your track is just good. You can have faith in that. And then you can eventually start to adapt. This is also why I recommend referencing on a lot of different listening environments. Don't just mix and master on your headphones. Mix and master on your computer speakers, on your laptop speakers, on your phone speakers, on your car speakers. Reference in all these different environments. See how it translates. You want to have universal translation across all mediums, if possible. But I mean, that is really what I would say. Like, don't stress too much about the specifics. Just reference and practice, and you'll get there. I think that is about it for today. I can't think of much else. Unless there's any other topics that anyone wants me to talk about, I think I'm going to call it. I'm going to go eat some food. I'm going to go get ready for my viewing of this apartment that I'm going to be looking at this afternoon. And hopefully we'll be back tomorrow, ready for Freebie Friday, more feedback, more commercial song analysis. Good on some, on so much. Well, then you got to listen to why it's not sounding so good. If it doesn't sound good on other speaker systems, but it sounds good on some, what's the difference? Write down what you hear. Write down the differences. Actually pay attention. Because it's not that it sounds good and bad. There's something about it that makes it sound good and something about it that makes it sound bad. And you got to try and figure out what that is. And I can't tell you what that is. I cannot tell you what's going on in your specific song. But if you're actually listening and you're like, well, there's more high end in the one that sounds bad, maybe I need to compress the high end to make sure that it's more consistent and it doesn't jump up. Because maybe one speaker system hypes it, one speaker system doesn't. So I want to have it more consistent. Things like that. Thank you so much, Savage Patch Kid. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for hanging out with me today. I apologize for the short stream, only about 4 hours. Frankly, I feel kind of bad about that, but, you know, life calls. Tomorrow, Freebie Friday, we'll be doing viewer track reviews, we're doing commercial song analysis, music memes, production speedrun challenges. We're going to be doing the results for the weekly challenge, which is really fucking fun. I'm going to be picking the next weekly challenge. I might not do a weekly challenge next week just because I'm going to be moving next weekend. Or not this coming weekend, but the weekend after. And we'll just see where it goes. So thank you all so much. I'm going to go find someone to raid. Let's see who's streaming. And I really, really thank you all so much for hanging out with me during this, because it's very rare that I feel like I actually know what I'm doing. And y'all help quite a bit. So let's see. Who is streaming? Looks like we're going by the rule of low view count. We're going to be raiding Carter. Go tell Carter to make hard bass. Just say, you make hard bass, Musar fish. Love you all so much. Have fun with Carter. Take care. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. See y'all tomorrow. Maybe see you tonight for Valhalla on Musar Plays. We'll see. We can talk about that more on the Discord. Give you guys some hearts. Sorry for hitting the mic. Bye.